G'day, Ross here. Excited to tell you about my new project entitled, modestly, Ross Recommends. We've never had more options on what we can do, and it's hard to know what's really worth your while. Every couple of weeks, I'll be joined by experts and friends to talk about what we've been loving, any aspect of life. Think of it as part review show, part book club, plenty of learning and laughs along the way. Subscribe and follow now to stay up to date with Ross Recommends, wherever you get your podcasts.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Monday, May 22nd. He's known as the Mr. Big of trafficking, and for the last few years, Binjun Xie has cultivated a lavish lifestyle in Sydney off the back of human misery. Evidence suggests that the crime syndicate boss has been exploiting women in an illegal prostitution ring here, moving them around like cattle from one hotel to another. But did it have to be this way? A report leaked last week reveals that Australian government authorities have failed to heed warnings about corrupt officials within our immigration and education systems who have enabled such sex rings and human trafficking to flourish. Today, investigative reporter Nick McKenzie on just how easily crime bosses like Binjun Xie have been able to game our visa system, and the secret and scathing report that aims to hold them to account. So, Nick, you've spent more than a year investigating an underground sex ring and human trafficking enterprise, and you've discovered grievous flaws and corruption within our own border security and immigration system that have enabled this abuse. And now a secret report into all of this about who's to blame and what can be done about it has been leaked. So what did you think when you first got your hands on this secret report, and how did you find it?
Well, getting the secret report, it's a report written by a former top cop, Christine Nixon, the former Chief Commissioner of the Victoria Police Force. We knew that Nixon, as a result of our earlier reporting, had been commissioned by the Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neill, to basically see if our reporting was correct and to see if the flaws and gaps we had identified in our border security, our visa system, which were being exploited by organised criminals, actually existed. So we knew the report was finished. We knew it had gone to government and a number of different agencies and been circulated, not widely, but amongst a range of people. We also knew the government was not releasing the report, at least not in the timeframe promised. The Home Affairs Minister had said it would come out before the budget. It hadn't come out before the budget. And so we were desperate to actually find out what was in the report. Getting the contents of the report was difficult. I can't go into confidential sources, but ultimately understanding what was in it was a massive relief in some respects because it did vindicate what we had found. In fact, Christine Nixon went far further than what we had said. And the next step is saying, well, how do we make sure that what she's found is actually acted upon? If it sits in some minister's desk or in a bureaucrat's drawer and the public never get to read it, nothing happens. So finding those findings was extremely important, and we wanted to tell the public, and we did.
So before we get into the contents of this secret report sort of even further, can you take us back a bit? Because your reporting is what prompted Claire O'Neill to order this inquiry into what's been called a broken migration system in the first place. And you have referred to this series of reporting that you've done as one of the wildest investigation rides in my 20-year career. So we've spoken about it a bit before, and Please Explain, but what exactly did you uncover?
Well, the investigation started from nothing, a few sort of tip-offs and bits and pieces that suggested that there was shocking exploitation of foreign workers in places like the underground sex industry. And we decided to look at the underground sex industry as sort of the most extreme example of where there might be foreign worker exploitation. And very quickly we began to uncover the fact that there's all these underground Asian sex syndicates. Women arrive in Australia, they're subjected to debt bondage, so they've got a big debt, they've got to pay it off, and they must sometimes work for nothing or for very little, servicing man after man in country town after country town across Australia in order to pay off their debt to effectively reclaim their freedom or their working rights.
I had to work night and day. You just need to have sex.
The fact that that's happening in First World Australia was shocking enough, but we quickly identified an organised crime boss who was running at least part of this system. Our own investigation can reveal a key player is a Chinese organised crime boss called Binjun Xie. And what's even more remarkable is he's done it all before in another country, which raises some... And the amazing thing was, a few phone calls to the United Kingdom, we managed to confirm this guy had been identified by the UK authorities as having done this in the UK. He'd been jailed for serious organised crime offences linked to human trafficking in the UK. Despite all that, he'd managed to come into Australia. How do you feel to learn that Binjun Xie is running the same operation, perhaps even bigger, in Australia?
I'm absolutely flabbergasted. I'm flabbergasted that he's able to get into Australia. It's unbelievable.
Surely someone in Australia... He should never have been led across the border. But not only was he led across the border, over many years he set up his own, what looks like extreme worker exploitation sex syndicate in Australia, making millions. This guy became a high roller at casinos, all under the noses of Australian authorities.
Why was not this man on the movement alert list? Why was he not refused using the extraordinarily powerful character provisions we have in the Migration Act?
That story of this man was really, for us, the case study which showed how broken the system was.
Wow, that's disturbing. So this secret report then that has been conducted by Christine Nixon, what does it reveal that we didn't already know from your original reporting?
The original reporting basically found a number of really disturbing case studies. Criminals coming into the country, rorting the migration system to exploit many foreign workers. The report looks at those case studies and then does a system-wide analysis to say, are these simply aberrations, or are they reflective of a system failure? And what Nixon found is that they are reflective of a system failure, that there is wide-scale rorting of our visa system, that there is a real degradation, in her words, of the investigative capacity of the Australian Border Force to do its job, to stop this sort of rorting, that we have an education system, overseas education system, set up in Australia that at least portions of it seem operating only to facilitate visa rorting, to allow foreign workers to come in as students but actually be exploited as workers in different fields, from the sex industry to agriculture, etc. So Nixon turned her spotlight across how the system is allowing sex trafficking, human trafficking, worker exploitation to occur. And she found these system failures, the failure of these agencies led by the Department of Home Affairs, led by Border Force, to do their job was part of the problem, and that these failures were entrenched, and that significant laws need changing. There must be major reform to make Australia a place where someone can come and not be exploited, and a place where organised criminals can't have a field day getting visas and rorting the system.
So, Nick, this complicated web of neglect and failures that have led to such horrific human rights abuses, it's pretty hard to believe. Can you take us through how exactly does this happen in a country where government after government prides themselves on securing our borders and protecting us from foreign threats?
Well, rather than my view, it's best to go to what Christine Nixon found. And one of her key findings, there's a few lines at the start of her report in the introduction and letter to the minister where she says it seems like the prioritisation of things like unauthorised maritime arrivals, which is official speak for boat arrivals, asylum seekers coming by boat. The focus on stopping the boats in Australia, which has been the plank of Tony Abbott's election and political success, a major fundamental policy core of successive parties on both sides. Stop the boats, stop the boats. The focus on that meant that our agencies were taking their eye off who was coming by plane. And the reality is that far more people arrived by plane who claimed asylum but were in fact not asylum seekers. They were either criminals seeking to exploit foreign workers, or they were foreign workers who were themselves being exploited, and the criminals had encouraged them to get an asylum seeker application in the system that would languish in the system for many years, and in that time they'd be exploited. Nixon also found then that our court system now, a system of the way people can appeal migration findings through the AAT, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, etc., it was so badly run, so clogged up, that it was allowing criminals to basically keep people in the country exploited and delaying. Every time that our country seeks to remove them, they simply put another appeal in place that buys them another 18 months, 2 years, 3 years. All that time they're here being exploited. So yet another component of our system that was meant to be put in place to ensure we got to pick who was a genuine asylum seeker and who was not was being rorted by criminals.
So ironically, what you're saying, if I understand it correctly, is that our law enforcement agencies have failed to tackle organized crime, sexual exploitation, because instead they've been prioritizing stopping illegal boats from arriving and maybe even sort of prioritizing cracking down on small drug busts. Do I have that right?
That's what Nixon said. It seems like the focus was taken off the plane arrivals because of the focus on other priorities, including boat people, asylum seekers coming by boat. Is that a surprise when you really think about it?
We have a proud record of welcoming people from 140 different nations. But we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
I mean, we had, especially coalition governments, stop the boats, stop the boats, stop the boats.
To stop the boats.
We can stop the boats, but
stopping the boats, or indeed...
That was their political mantra. The agencies, following that political mandate, put a huge amount of time, energy, resources into Operation Sovereign Borders, the key operation to stop boat arrivals. But that saw a huge investigative shift away from the organised criminals using the plane system to bring people in. And the fact of the matter is that far more people have arrived in Australia by plane and shouldn't be here than have arrived or tried to arrive in Australia by boat. And how that ball was dropped, I think there's a lot further for this scandal to play out if the public are really going to understand where the system is broken down. Does the current Labor government want to lift under these rocks? Well, that's an open question. They haven't released the Nixon report. They must. They must release the full report to the public. They must explain fully to the public what they're going to do to fix the system, and that's yet to happen.
I mean, what do you make of the government stalling the release of this report? Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said last week that it would be released, quote, when appropriate, unquote. And this was after he'd already indicated that he was incredibly disturbed by the investigations that you'd written and that the government would act to repair a broken immigration system. So does this reveal a worrying weakness in government?
Well, words are cheap and words are easy. And frankly, commissioning a former top cop to do a report is achievable. Nixon, to her credit, has not pulled her punches. The difficult part is acting on her findings. And government is facing really a nightmare. On one hand, it's got this overseas education sector, of which vast portions are basically facilitating organised crime and rorting of our visa system. That's one thing that needs to be fixed. You've got migration agents licensed by the federal government who are rorting the system, who are getting paid by criminals to bring people in, to do things like grow vast cannabis farms in parts of Australia. The migration agents and their registration needs to be fixed. You've got the failure of Border Force to do its job in investigating this visa rorting on the ground. That needs to be fixed. So the government's looking at all these different areas going, God almighty, there is a huge amount of reform, of resource, etc. that needs to go to fixing these problems. And I suggest that's why there's a stalling in releasing the report, because now the serious, complicated, expensive work of fixing a broken system must be undertaken, and that's difficult. And the Prime Minister and the Home Affairs Minister and Cabinet know it.
And so we do finally have this report, though it, of course, hasn't been released properly to the public. Does it offer any solutions to this entire horrifying situation?
It does. And the neatness of what Christine Nixon has done is to say, well, I'm going to expose these system failings in sections, and I'm going to suggest some policy fixes. And I'll do it simply and clearly. She's called for significant funding for a 3-year task force, multi-agency task force led by the Australian Border Force to actually stop these crime syndicates doing what they're doing and to protect foreign workers from this exploitation. That's one recommendation. She said that migration agents who play a key role in our system of helping people get visas, they need to be properly regulated, investigated, and have far better character background checks. Another reform she's proposing. She's also proposing that our money laundering laws are changed to ensure that migration agents, those who work in the migration sector, have responsibilities to report suspected money laundering. A huge component of this crime type she's looked at and we've exposed involves money laundering, because there's all this money getting made from these dodgy work practices, these underground brothels. Lots of it's being wired back overseas to China and elsewhere.
And it's millions, right? It's many, many millions.
Oh, it's not millions, it's hundreds of millions of dollars by some estimates, and it's flowing pretty freely. She's saying this needs to be dealt with. There needs to be better investigation and regulation of these money flows. Now, there's a lot of work yet to go into them, but she's laid down a roadmap to reform. And she includes in her report, really, it's like a plea from the heart. She says Australia prides itself on being a place of fairness, of just working rights. We can't be a country where people come to and get exploited. Without system reform, we will remain a place where Asian women come and endure what she calls the most abhorrent of crimes. We'll remain a place where Vietnamese students come here and are sent to farms to grow vast crops of marijuana. We'll remain a place where foreign workers are exploited, paid a few bucks an hour for dirty, dangerous work. If we want Australia not to be that place, and I suggest that everybody is in on that, then her reform suggestions are a starting place for fixing this broken system.
Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Hannah Mills-Turbot, with technical assistance from David McMillan. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
I'm Elise.
And I'm Tom. As Oscar Wilde once said,
Ultimately, the bond of all companionship, whether in marriage or in friendship, is conversation.
Welcome to our husband-wife podcast, The Elliott Exchange. What could possibly go wrong?
Find out with us by tapping the follow or subscribe button on The Elliott Exchange, wherever you get your podcast.